Hello. Today we're going to look at the effects of the French and Indian War, and we're going to start our discussion by looking at mercantilism, which was the economic system that prevailed in Western Europe as a part of their system of colonization of the Americas. And we want to look at how this system ultimately set in motion the events that will lead to the American Revolution. So we're going to have a big discussion about economies, and you're going to learn more about mercantilism than you probably thought ever existed or you needed to know. But this may explain why Great Britain did what they did. So most students know that there are going to be taxes in the 1760s and 1770s, and a series of incidents that are going to bring the colonists to a place where they want to seek their own independence. Today, we're looking for the economic reasons behind that. So again, briefly, we're going to look at this idea of mercantilism, in which a nation's power depends on its wealth based upon exporting more than it imports, and certainly having a system of colonies in which you can be producing lots of raw materials and agricultural goods that are sold globally, but also that those items can then be turned into finished products, which not only could be sold globally, but also back to the colonists themselves. England has a very large population of English colonists in the New World by the mid 1700s. And so this system really is truly economic exchange between the Old World and the New World. But the way mercantilism worked wasn't just simply there was this informal relationship. Great Britain is going to have a whole series of policies that they're going to start developing in the 1600s. They are also going to fund many of these endeavors to make sure that you have, in many cases, monopolistic practice in terms of trade. And they're also going to grant people charters to establish colonies and also to establish manufacturing. So there's a lot of government intervention going on. But an example of a monopolistic practice would be something like the East India Tea Company. So a group of investors were given a charter. They then had colonized a portion of India for the purposes of producing tea, which many English people bought, not only back in England, but also in the colonies and elsewhere. But they were the only tea company that was British. There were other tea companies. There was a Dutch East India Tea Company, but that was a rival nation's monopoly. And it was really easy for England to simply make laws that if you wanted anything other than East India tea, you were going to pay an additional tax. So people were encouraged to only buy from Great Britain's tea company. Same thing also affected what we would look at as the slave trade today, something called the Royal African Company. So by the 1660s, Great Britain will take control over the importation of Africans to the New World, especially in the 13 colonies, but also to many of the islands in the Caribbean as well. And so if you were an English landowner who chose to use slave labor, you were buying enslaved people from a monopoly that was sponsored by the British government. They also created what were known as the Lords of Trade, and these were members of the House of Lords, so people who had a hereditary title and therefore a position in government, and they created all of the various laws. They also would grant charters for people to start plantations. They are going to be the people who suggest to King James I in 1624 that he should make Virginia a royal colony because it had proven to be quite profitable in its production of tobacco. They're also going to be people who are going to encourage James II to create what was the Dominion of New England in 1686. And although that only lasted 3 years, it was again an attempt to take what were these colonies and provide a steady income specifically for the crown. So you have literally a law-making body, a group of people who specialize in how can we regulate this system for the greatest amount of profit for ourselves, for our king, and for our nation as a whole. A big part of these rules will become known as the Navigation Acts. So starting in the 1650s and all the way up through the early 1760s, there were hundreds of laws created for the purposes of regulating trade on the high seas, in particular in the Atlantic world. And a lot of this was just to prevent competition. So they might pass a law, a navigation act, that wouldn't make it possible for French ships to come into American ports. Or they might say that if you wanted to buy a particular product and that was coming from another nation's colony, like Spain, for instance, that good would actually have to get its way all the way to England and then be put on another English ship bound for the colonies again. But English colonists couldn't directly make purchases, let's say, from the Spanish colonies in the New World. One of the big items that the British will never have significant control of in the 1600s is sugar production. That will be something that the Spanish and the French have a lot of control of in the Caribbean. So that will be an issue that we will see all the way through the 1760s and 1770s. Everybody wants sugar. People want to get it as cheaply as possible. But there is concern that if that is something that Great Britain can't directly provide its colonists, which it couldn't, it then needed to make sure that colonists were going to pay a tax for it that did go to the crown. So again, sugar would have been an item, or molasses or rum. Those are all sugar derivatives that would find its way going from, let's say, Haiti, what we call Haiti today, Saint-Domingue, all the way to England and then back on English ships so the colonists could have sugar in their tea. And by 1663, any item that a colonist would want to buy, they are going to have to buy it off a ship that had already taken those items to England first. In order to also regulate and enforce these rules, the Lords of Trade created something called Vice Admiralty Courts. And these courts had tremendous power. So if you were caught smuggling, you might go to a Vice Admiralty Court. They enforced a lot of the navigation acts with ships coming in and out of England directly. They did very little of enforcement in the colonies. That will all change after the French and Indian War. And then you're also going to see growing naval warfare. So we talked about the 50 years before the French and Indian War. The English Navy by the 1590s is the largest in the world. It's incredibly powerful. It's defeated the Spanish Armada. And England is going to begin directing money for the purposes of building ships. And why do we need naval ships? Well, they're going to control trade. They're going to protect English vessels all over the globe. And they will use this power in lots of different ways. So they might directly attack ships or fortifications elsewhere in the world for control. They certainly went against the Dutch in the 1650s that way. By 1664, they will use the British Navy to capture what was New Amsterdam, which was what we call New York today. They didn't even have to fire a shot. They just sailed 300 naval vessels with lots of Marines aboard, saying that we will attack the colony if you don't hand over control. And for the Dutch who were living there at that time and all the other immigrants, it was simply easier just to take on a new ruler. We're also going to see a lot more British ships in the Atlantic and elsewhere because they're protected. They don't have to necessarily worry about piracy in the ways they would have prior to the 1640s. So certainly by the 1650s, 1660s, we've got a system of laws, we've got a large navy, and that's going to further increase England's ability to dominate trade. So let's take it back to where we are in terms of the end of the French and Indian War. So in 1763, salutary neglect officially ends. One of our effects of the French and Indian War is that Great Britain incurs 75 million pounds of debt, which very quickly will continue to grow and grow and grow. And in order to try to pay down this debt, governments typically tax or they regulate in some way and charge fees. That's what the British government needed to do, but they had already heavily taxed their own people in England for the cost of these many wars and the growth of what will be this mercantilist system. And so, who is left to tax? Well, it's the colonists who are back in the New World. There are plenty of them. They have disposable money, they have income that many people in England don't have. There were a lot more middle class people in the colonies than there ever were in England. And the population has ever been steadily growing throughout the 1700s. So for Parliament, this seems like the perfect answer to their debt issues. So although by 1713, a lot of colonists had, for the most part, paid very little to no taxes, this is going to end. So the end of the time when colonists were not having to pay all of these taxes, we know it as salutary neglect, and it ends in 1763. And at that point, there is now what is known as an Imperial Administration. There are going to be a group of people within the bureaucracy in England who are going to look at how can we get money out of the colonists and how can we protect our investment. So before the French and Indian War, we had very few English troops in the colonies. But after the war, to try to maintain peace, not only with native peoples living west of the Appalachian Mountains, but also making sure that we could continue to protect areas that had already just been taken from the French or the Spanish. About 10,000 forces are left behind. Those people need to be housed, they need to be fed, they need to be paid their salaries. And so Great Britain now has taken on all this land, but it is also going to have to provide a military force to protect it as well. We're going to see growth in bureaucracy, and again, in an effort to try to pay down this debt and protect now all of the land that Great Britain has acquired through this Treaty of Paris of 1763, they're actually encouraging even more debt and more taxes. Another thing to understand about how the colonies functioned relative to England is that every colony by the 1760s is a royal colony. It has a royal governor, and that person is appointed by the crown. And until 1765, if you were the royal governor of pretty much every colony except maybe Virginia, your salary came from the assembly. So local peoples were taxed by the assembly, and that money was paid to the royal governor. Why was Virginia different? Well, Virginia was considered the fifth dominion. So if there are four parts of the United Kingdom, certainly of that day, which would have been Scotland and England and Wales and Ireland, those were the four dominions. The fifth dominion was the colony of Virginia. And that was the best position to have as a royal governor. You got lots of land, and you were very well paid by the crown. But everybody else, your salary depended on the assembly. What money could they raise from the colonists themselves? So on my screen, you see a picture of a man in his finery here. This is Governor Tryon, who was the last royal governor of North Carolina. And this is a recreation, but this was the palace that he built. You can go visit it today out in New Bern. It's called Tryon Palace. And he insisted on living well and being paid well, although he probably had the worst of all the royal governor positions. During the Revolutionary War, he will encourage loyalists to come support the crown, and as a reward, he will find himself becoming the royal governor of New York eventually, which was a very well-paid position. But certainly by 1765, England understands that they need the royal governors to do as they wish, not as the assemblies wish. The assemblies might not like something that the royal governor did based on the advice of Parliament and the crown. So they would be more difficult in paying his bills, in giving him money. They wanted to take that element of power and control away from the colonial assemblies and put power in the hands of the royal governors. Assemblies also were responsible for when would they call out a militia. In most cases. And so you may have a governor who needed a militia or felt he needed the colonists to arm themselves to come solve some problem. But the assemblies ultimately made the decision more often than not. And when they did, it meant that the royal governor, in many cases, was just a figurehead. And that was a system that by 1765 was not going to work in favor of this increased control of the colonies that Parliament needed. Starting in the 1760s, we're also going to see a series of laws that are going to be passed. And these are some that you have some familiarity with because these are the taxes which groups like the Sons of Liberty will rail against. But it didn't start simply at the end of the French and Indian War. Before that, really 3 years before the war was finally concluded with a peace treaty, it was obvious that there was great debt, and Parliament wanted to do some things in order to try to improve the situation. So they will pass 3 laws before the famous Stamp Act that also were very important in attempting to get money out of the colonies and back into the hands of Parliament. The first one was called the Revenue Act. And the Revenue Act basically is a law saying that there will be customs agents and they are going to enforce taxes. So when a ship comes into a colonial port, all of the cargo is checked and a tax is paid to the customs officer before any of that cargo is released from the ship. Prior to 1762, in some ports, there just wasn't always a customs officer on board, or in some cases, people just didn't pay the taxes. So making sure there was a system in which all of the ships coming in would be inventoried and then taxes collected. That was the Revenue Act. 2 years later, they passed something called the Currency Act. And the Currency Act was about money. So in colonial America, you had lots of different kinds of paper money. Pretty much every colony issued its own form of paper money, but it was not as valuable as being paid in gold or silver. So for the colonists, they often didn't have access to much gold or silver coin, so they loved being able to pay for everything with paper money. In 1764, Parliament said that paper money was no longer legal tender when buying goods that came directly from Great Britain. So you could not use this paper money to buy goods that were ship-bound to the New World. You could only buy those goods if you had gold or silver coins. And the reason they did this is because gold and silver are what we call hedges against inflation. Paper money, it's much easier to inflate a currency, but gold basically has its own commensurate value. And so they wanted to get all the gold or silver out of the colonies and in the hands of Parliament to pay their debts to other nations. And so the Currency Act did that as well. The other thing they passed was called the Sugar Act. For a number of years, any kind of French molasses, which is a byproduct of sugar, essentially sugar if you want to think about it in a much more shelf-stable form, that molasses didn't have a duty. It was one of those items that could come into the colonies without a duty added to it if it was from a French sugar island. It was an agreement that had been made between the two countries. As of 1764, there now has been a duty added to that. For most of the colonists, what they would have cooked with, what they would have used to sweeten their food would have been molasses. So they essentially an important good to them now was being taxed. And then Vice Admiralty Court said, we need to catch the smugglers. We need those people to be captured and brought back to England, and we will have them stand trial there. There were no juries at these trials, so it was essentially 3 judges. They'd hear the evidence against you, and they would penalize you. And this is something that had not happened commonly in the past. The gentleman on my screen, you do not know him by his face probably, but you do know him by his signature. His name is John Hancock, and he was probably the wealthiest merchant in colonial England. One of the things that he was able to do is build a merchant empire that was both legal and illegal. So he brought in lots of goods legally. He ran ships from England to the colonies, mostly coming in and out of the port of Boston. But he also smuggled a lot of goods that would have been of Dutch or French or Spanish or Portuguese origin. And those items were not taxed. He was able to sell these to his customers at a discount because they were essentially tax-free items. He was someone where this idea that now if his business was caught smuggling, he himself could be arrested, sent to England, and face trial made him very nervous about his business interests. And it may explain why someone like John Hancock, who was incredibly wealthy, had a lot of power in colonial America, was also one of the most vocal advocates for this revolution and for this independence movement. From 1762 on, his bottom line was directly impacted by these laws that England was passing. There's some other things going on too in the colonies at this time. There is a tradition of resistance in America, and that tradition doesn't start with the Revolution. It's something that we've seen in even earlier periods of American history. So whether that was Bacon's Rebellion, certainly there was this idea that government was suspect. Local government that you created was perhaps better than the government that was on the other side of the Atlantic. But there were people who did come to the colonies for the purposes of getting away from government involvement and government control. And certainly the Scots-Irish as a group were probably the most significant in this idea. So just to recap, our Scots-Irish are people who typically were actually Scottish. They had been involved in what was an attempt for Scottish independence in the 1730s and 1740s. And when that unrest was put down by the British government, the leadership was arrested. And some of these people spent years in prison and then were sent as indentures to British North America. Others just ran for their lives. Some of them actually had a stopping point in Ireland before they got to the colonies, but that's where their name came from. Those people predominantly came to what was the back country of North Carolina, Virginia. They came to the back country of Pennsylvania. These were people who, either by choice or by force, were coming to the New World. And when they got here, they wanted to separate themselves from government as much as possible. And right now, we're going to look at two different groups of people who were part of that resistance. And how might that idea of resistance further enable an independence movement in the 1770s. So the first group was the regulator movement, which actually took place here in North Carolina, in this area actually, basically from the center of what would be North Carolina today all the way to the mountains. And these were mostly farmers. They were people who raised enough tobacco to sell once a year, that they could use that money to pay for other things that they needed. They grew a little food as well. They probably bartered a lot with their neighbors. And the way farmers often operate, even to this day, is that they buy things on credit because whatever product they're growing is going to take many months to come to full growth and harvest and to be sold on. And so if I was a farmer in Western North Carolina in the 1760s, in order to go to the cobbler and get shoes for my kid, or to make sure that I could maybe have a little money if I had to pay the doctor, I would do this all on credit. Maybe the local merchant, I would have a line of credit with him. And then come September, October, I sold my harvest and I had cash to pay all these people back. Well, unfortunately, over the course of the 1760s, the price of tobacco kept falling. And so every year you would sell your harvest, and even if it was the same amount as the year before, it was worth less. And so more and more farmers found that they had outstanding debts. Well, merchants need to be paid. This is the way business works. If somebody owes you money and you can't get it from them, you often go to court. And that's what people did back in the 1760s. And the courts usually would just order a confiscation of property. And that might mean the furniture in your house. It could also mean your livestock. It could also mean the actual land you're farming to feed your family and provide for its financial well-being. And there were enough farmers who were experiencing this that they began to gang up and realize that you can't have a verdict in court if you don't have a judge, or that you can't have a trial if the court isn't open. And so they used a lot of violence and intimidation to close courts. They burned down courthouses. They intimidated judges. They would make stuffed items that looked like the judge and burn them in effigy. Whatever it took, so court wouldn't be in session and people would not have courts confiscating their property. They also demanded that there be lower property taxes. When Governor Tryon took over in North Carolina, he raised taxes, again, because they were his salary. So he wanted to make sure that he was well paid. But for these backcountry farmers, they just didn't have the money. Governor Tryon decided that the best course of action after having almost 5 years of unrest was to call together a militia, which was, for the most part, a lot of Eastern peoples who perhaps lived a little bit better than their Western counterparts, and some British troops, and they met each other and began to fight. And unfortunately, these farmers were lucky if they had a single rifle. Some of these people came to fight and show their resistance with pitchforks and other farm implements, but it was a resistance that the regulation eventually was put down by 1771. And they even took what they thought were the ringleaders and publicly executed them. But this regulator movement encouraged people to see that perhaps there are times when taxation might be unfair, that if people don't feel that they have any role in trying to make sure that the laws and the taxes that they're required to pay have their input, they're going to resist. And so when we look at what is the resistance movement, the anti-tax movement, sometimes associate with that group, the Sons of Liberty in the 1770s, some of its seeds, some of its origin is going to come from things like the regulation. Another resistance movement, which I think is a far more negative story, was a group called the Paxton Boys. And they actually existed a little bit before the time of the regulation in Pennsylvania. And the Paxton Boys were not boys. They were men. They were farmers who lived out west. So west of Philadelphia, anywhere from about 50 to 100 miles. And they wanted to be able to live out in the West, and they wanted to do so on land that was cheap. In many cases, they wanted to just effectively go and squat and claim land. But that land belonged to Native people. From the time that Pennsylvania was created in the 1680s, the Quakers, and certainly William Penn's vision, was that he was gaining access to land, and he still had to pay the proper respect, monies, and only had limited control of the land in the colony because there were Native people who also had that land. The Quaker government would not allow these people to be able to expel Native people, told them they should not use violent action against these people. And a group of Western farmers decided that they were going to make their position known and see if the government would come and attempt to intervene in any way. And they attacked a group of Native people known as the Conestoga. And the Conestoga actually lived in a town in western Pennsylvania where they taught children English. Most of the people who lived in the town who were Conestoga dressed very much like their English counterparts. And so it was a town that was probably more sophisticated than a lot of the outlying farms that these farmers actually owned. But they went after the Conestoga tribe because there were certain traditions that they maintained, including a fall hunt every year, and decided to attack them when most of the adult males would be gone from the community. And there was a massacre. They then decided to march on to Philadelphia and said that they were in the numbers by the hundreds at this point, that they would burn Philadelphia to the ground if they could not get access to the land that they wanted in Western Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin was already not only a noted scientist and entrepreneur, but he was also representing various factions in Pennsylvania and other colonial governments at that time. And he was asked to negotiate a truce with the leadership of these farmers. And he did. But the agreement was that these people would leave and not actually cause damage to Philadelphia. They would return back to their farms, but they would do so without having to face justice for their actions against the Conestoga tribe. And there were supposedly no witnesses who could even give evidence if this had ever tried to come to trial. But it really was the last time that you had Quaker control of the government in Pennsylvania. Very rapidly, you saw that when they had elections, non-Quakers were being elected, and certainly the policies towards Native people radically changed due to that. But both of these things create the situation in which we have colonists who are unhappy. They feel that something is unjust. By today's standards, we may not see it as unjust, but they certainly did. And they take some kind of violent action against it. Their protest is one besides just simply signing their name to a piece of paper. They might burn things. They might attack people, threaten violence. And with both the Paxton Boys and the Regulators, these colonists did these things, and the colonial government and the British government backed down. They didn't really take any kind of direct action until it was too late, in a sense. With the Paxton Boys, they just allowed those people to get away with murder, literally. In the case of the Regulators, yes, they put down the force of the regulation in Alamance in 1771. They did execute some of their leadership, but they let the rest of those people return home and believe that they had just hopefully, resolved the issue. But the idea that you can show resistance, not pay taxes, not comply with the law, and probably get away with it becomes a pattern throughout the 1760s and into the 1770s. It's not to say that the British government would have been justified in having martial law and laying control to every single colonist who tried to rise up and protest. But in not doing so, ultimately, Great Britain created the problems that will become the American Revolution for them. So we're going to close out today with just one last thing, which is just to give you a little bit of background about politics in England in the 1760s and 1770s. So not every person in Parliament felt that the colonists should be continuously taxed. They didn't all feel that there shouldn't be any kind of representation in Parliament for the colonies. You had two distinct factions, and prior to the early 1800s, we did not call these things political parties. We called them factions. And the division politically in Parliament was of two groups. One group was called the Tories, and they were usually the elites. They were members of the House of Lords. They were people who are heavily invested in most cases in the empire, whether that was in trading vessels, plantations in places like India and in North America. Those people want to see as many laws and as much bureaucracy as possible to maintain this mercantilist system. The other faction were the Whigs. These were people who were usually elected to the House of Commons. So they were not a hereditary position. If I was in the House of Lords, I was there because I was a landed person, a noble person, and from father to son, this position would have been passed on. If I was a member of the House of Commons, I ran for election every so often. And so although most of the public didn't actually vote, those who did, I would have been somebody who did not have this hereditary power. But the Whigs, these were people who often were very closely connected to the ideals of the Enlightenment, what we might call Republican ideals, where we have representative government. We're trying to move away from hereditary rights in government. They typically had sympathy with the colonists, and we will see during the American Revolution, there will be Whigs who believe that the revolution should just be able to take place and that the British government should get out of the way, that it's not worth fighting for. The Whigs also typically came from the Puritan tradition of Oliver Cromwell, those people who controlled government for about 20 years after the English Civil War. Again, their cousins being the people who would have founded places like New England. They believed that the empire was too expensive. They believed all these laws and taxes were a self-fulfilling prophecy, that the more you taxed and the more you grew government, the more you would have to tax. And so they really wanted to see an England that had less colonies. They believed in the end it would prove to be too expensive. It will, but that won't be something that Parliament truly will resolve until the 20th century. The word Whig is also going to be a political term used in the United States in the early 1800s. It usually means the faction out of power. So the Tories throughout this period will have a tremendous amount of power. They will lose that power gradually throughout the early part of the 19th century. But certainly in the period we're looking at now, the Tories are going to be incredibly powerful. They're going to be pro-empire, and they're going to be willing to do anything possible to keep that empire intact, including fight their own English cousins in the New World to maintain it. So we will stop there today. That's a lot of information about taxes and the economy and how people might have been living as colonists encountering these English laws in the 1760s and 1770s. As always, I encourage you, ask questions to me or Mr. Haregrove. We want students to have a full understanding of history, but we know that's a lot of information. So we appreciate that you've watched and you've listened. Don't forget that these notes are also attached, so you have the benefit of being able to look over them again. But please make sure you're asking questions. We want to make sure that you have a full understanding each time we meet together on Zoom.